This video is audio content only. It does not contain any video footage or images. If you are expecting visual content, please be aware. This is intentionally provided in an audio-only format. We recommend listening to the audio rather than watching the screen. Thank you for your understanding. Welcome to our exploration of the coupeurs de feu, the legendary fire cutters of Europe. For centuries, these healers have used ancestral secrets to extinguish the pain of searing burns. We will journey from medieval rituals to modern oncology wards, discovering how this practice has adapted to the digital age of smartphones and SMS. We'll examine the pragmatic alliance between healers and doctors, the science of belief, and the ethics of a gift that must never be sold. Join us as we bridge the gap between ancient mystery and modern medicine. Chapter 1. The Ancestral Secret. Origins and the Sacred Ritual. The image of a healer standing over a victim of a sudden searing burn is one that has persisted in the rural landscapes of France, Switzerland, and Belgium for centuries. Long before the advent of modern emergency rooms and specialized burn units, communities relied on a figure known as the coupeur de feu, or fire cutter. These individuals were not doctors, nor were they typically seen as professional mystics. Instead, they were often the person next door, the baker, the schoolteacher, or the retired farmer, who possessed a specific inherited ability to stop the pain of a burn and, according to tradition, halt its physical progression. This practice, often referred to as the secret, represents a profound intersection of folk tradition, spiritual heritage, and communal trust that has survived the Enlightenment, the Industrial Revolution, and the rise of modern clinical science. To understand the origins of the fire cutters, one must look back to the late Middle Ages, a period where the line between medicine, religion, and what some might call magic was perpetually blurred. Historical records and ethnographic studies suggest that these practices were already well established by the 14th century. Unlike the purely oral tradition of today, early traces of these healing formulas can be found in specific medieval texts. The Antidote Nicolas, a famous medieval pharmacopoeia, along with the writings of renowned physicians like Bernard de Gourdon and Arnaud de Villeneuve between the 13th and 15th centuries, documented various charms and rhythmic incantations used to treat physical ailments. In these isolated pockets of the countryside, the fire cutter emerged as a guardian of a specific kind of wisdom, acting as a faisceau de secret, or secret maker, who claimed to have formulas for everything from stopping hemorrhages to curing skin conditions. The transition of these practices from documented medical curiosities to a strictly guarded secret was largely driven by the shifting religious and political landscape of the 13th century. As the Inquisition gained power, the Catholic Church sought to establish a monopoly over both the soul and the body. Non-clerical healers, particularly those using vernacular prayers or rituals not sanctioned by the papacy, were increasingly viewed with suspicion. The Inquisition often categorized these practitioners as sorcerers or enemies of the Church. To survive, the faiseurs de secret were forced into the shadows. This historical pressure established the seal of secrecy that persists today. The practice became a hidden domestic ritual, protected by a code of silence that served as a defense against persecution. This tension with religious authority has never entirely vanished. Even in the contemporary era, the modern Catholic Church has expressed formal caution regarding the practice, warning of potential psychological or spiritual manipulation, and questioning the source of the healer's power, which remains outside the official sacraments. This clandestine heritage is often supported by folk legends that provide a biblical pedigree for the secret. One fascinating legend traces the practice back to the Mount of Olives and the figure of Judas Iscariot. In some regional traditions, it is whispered that Judas learned the secret of barring fire during the events of the Passion and used the power as a way to repent for his betrayal, or that the secret was a fragment of divine knowledge passed down from that biblical event to a chosen few. Whether viewed as a gift of mercy or a remnant of ancient apocrypha, these stories reinforce the idea that the secret was a sacred trust, not to be shared lightly with the uninitiated. The core of the firecutter's power remains the ritual of transmission, a process governed by a strict and unyielding set of traditional rules. This is not a set of instructions found in a textbook, but a specific formula, often a short prayer or a rhythmic incantation that must be transmitted orally from one person to another. Traditionally, a firecutter only passes their secret to a single individual, often a family member, and frequently only when they feel their own life is drawing to a close. There is a deep-seated belief that if the secret is revealed to too many people, or if it is ever written down, it will lose its efficacy entirely. This requirement for oral, one-on-one transmission has turned the practice into a living chain of human connection that stretches back through generations. The elder must believe the younger is worthy, possessing the right temperament to handle the pain of others without being overwhelmed, while the younger must be willing to hold the secret in silence, never boasting of it. While the modern image of the firecutter is often one of quiet mental focus, historical and regional variations reveal a more tactile ritualistic past. In some lineages, the décompteuse ritual was common, where the healer would blacken their thumb on the soot of a tripod or a cauldron before tracing a cross over the burn. In other regions, practitioners known as souffleurs employ a different technique, blowing in a precise cross pattern over the burn to symbolically extinguish the heat. Others utilized physical objects like specific herbs, amulets, or even pieces of wool to draw out the heat. These physical elements served as conduits for the intention of the healer. In the west of France and Brittany, they are often called barreurs de feu, or fire blockers, because they are seen as placing an invisible barrier between the burn and the rest of the body. In the central regions, they might be called panseurs de feu, using an old French term that means to care for or dress a wound through thought or prayer. The physical sensation reported by the healers during the ritual is remarkably consistent. Many describe a feeling of intense heat rising into their own hands or arms, as if they are literally absorbing the fire from the victim. Once the pain has subsided for the patient, the healer often feels the need to wash their hands in cold water or drink large amounts of water to evacuate the heat they have taken into themselves. This domesticity is what has allowed the tradition to survive. It doesn't demand that the patient abandon logic, but offers a quiet, additional layer of comfort alongside traditional care. The formulas themselves, though hidden, often invoke powerful religious symbols and elemental contrasts. A very common foundation for these prayers is the story of Saint Lawrence, a 3rd-century martyr sentenced to death by being grilled alive. Tradition holds that he bore the pain with such supernatural stoicism that he eventually told his executioners to turn him over because he was done on one side. Because of this association with surviving the flames, he became the patron saint of firecutters, and his name is frequently woven into the whispered formulas used to bar the fire. Other documented formulas rely on elemental imagery, such as the invocation of angels from the north and south, where one brings the heat and the other brings the cold, or the symbolic opposition of fire versus salt, where the healer commands the fire to lose its strength just as salt loses its savor. One widely used traditional formula commands the fire to stop its progress with the direct words, "Fire that burns, fire that heats, by this formula I command you to withdraw." A pivotal moment in the modernization and survival of this tradition occurred in 1951 with the formation of the Gorma. This organization sought to protect the reputation of firecutters by establishing a set of ethical guidelines, distancing the practice from the accusations of sorcery or charlatanism that had led to legal persecutions in the late 19th century. The Gorma emphasized that fire cutting should always be a free service, that it should never replace conventional medical treatment, and that the healers should remain humble and discreet. This shift helped the practice transition from a hidden rural superstition into a tolerated and sometimes even welcomed complementary therapy.
This traditional approach stands in stark contrast to the modern medical standards for burn treatment. Today, the rule of 315s is the clinical benchmark, cooling the burn with 15 degrees Celsius water from a distance of 15 centimeters for at least 15 minutes. While the fire cutter focuses on the metaphysical extraction of heat through whispered words and ancient symbols, modern medicine focuses on the rapid reduction of tissue temperature to prevent deep cellular damage. The persistence of the fire cutter in the age of the 315s highlights a unique cultural refusal to choose between the physical and the metaphysical. The transmission of the gift often skips generations or finds its way to individuals who show a particular kind of empathy. Healers describe receiving the gift as a sacerdoce, a calling, or a duty. The person who receives the secret accepts a lifelong commitment to be available at any hour. Because the gift is seen as something given by a higher power or a natural force, there is a strong cultural taboo against profiting from it. The traditional view is that the moment a fire cutter begins to charge for their services, the secret will fail them. This commitment to gratuity has been a major factor in the practice's continued social acceptance, as it removes the primary motivation for fraud. The ritualistic nature of the transmission also involves a specific psychological state for both the giver and the receiver. In many villages, everyone knows who has the secret, but no one talks about it openly until an accident occurs. It is an unspoken safety net, a piece of the Middle Ages that continues to function in the era of the smartphone. The cultural identity of the fire cutter is also tied to the landscape. In the rugged mountains of the Jura or the misty fields of Brittany, the practice feels like a natural extension of the environment, a form of local knowledge like knowing which herbs grow in which meadow. As the older generation of fire cutters passes away, the question of transmission becomes more urgent. In a world that is increasingly transparent and documented, the requirement for a whispered oral secret is a rare holdout of true mystery. Yet, the practice shows a surprising resilience. Many young people, having seen the effects of a fire cut on a sibling or a parent, are seeking out their elders to ensure the chain remains unbroken. They see it not as an alternative to science, but as a piece of their cultural DNA that deserves to be preserved. The ritual of oral transmission ensures that the practice remains personal. It cannot be automated, and it cannot be mass-produced. It requires two human beings to stand together and share a moment of profound trust. This ancient chain of whispered words continues to provide a sense of continuity and comfort, proving that some secrets are too valuable to be forgotten in the rush of the modern world. The fire cutter stands as a bridge between the medieval world and the digital age, a quiet reminder that there are still mysteries that pass from mouth to ear, held in the silence of a shared secret.
This transition of the secret from the deathbeds of the past to the phone calls of the present has set the stage for a new era in the history of the fire cutters. As the practice moved out of the farmhouse and into the wider world, it began to interact with the new tools of the digital age in ways that the original secret makers could never have imagined. The power of intention, once confined to a physical touch, was about to be tested by the boundaries of distance and the technology of the future. How would a medieval prayer, born in the shadows of the Inquisition, adapt to the speed of a text message?
Chapter 2. Digital Embers. Healing via SMS.
The modern world is defined by a relentless drive toward transparency, data, and immediate physical presence. Yet in the quiet corners of the digital landscape, an ancient and invisible network is thriving. While the traditional image of the fire cutter involves a weathered healer standing in a rustic farmhouse, the reality of the 21st century is far more likely to involve a smartphone, a high-speed internet connection, and a series of text messages. The practice of fire cutting has not only survived the transition to the digital age, but has arguably found its most efficient form within it. Today, the secret travels through fiber optic cables and cellular towers, proving that for those who practice this art, the power of intention is entirely independent of physical proximity.
This digital evolution is perhaps best illustrated by the experience of Angeline Liu in the city of Toulouse. In the winter of 2021, Liu was navigating the exhausting reality of breast cancer treatment. Radiotherapy, while life-saving, had left her skin raw, red, and radiating a heat that made even the softest clothing feel like sandpaper. Every day, after returning from the oncology clinic, she performed a ritual that bridged the gap between cutting-edge medical science and medieval folk tradition. She would take a clear photograph of the irritated skin on the right side of her body and send it via a messaging app to a man named Henry. Henri was not a doctor, but a fire cutter Liu had come to trust. A few hours after sending the photo, her phone would ring. They would speak briefly, Henri checking on her mood and her pain levels, and then the work would begin. Henri would set the phone aside, open the image Liu had sent, and begin to murmur his whispered formulas. Even through the screen, Liu reported a profound sense of relief. She described it as a feeling of the fire being evacuated from her skin. For Liu, the fact that Henri was not in the room, or even in the same neighborhood, was irrelevant. The digital image served as a proxy for her physical self, a focal point for Henri's intention that allowed the healing ritual to take place across the city's airwaves. This reliance on photographs and remote communication is a cornerstone of modern fire cutting. Practitioners like Roger Purnell, who operates out of the Munch region, have standardized this process for the digital era. When a patient undergoing radiotherapy contacts him, he asks for 3 specific things: a photograph of the burn, the patient's full name and coordinates, and the exact location where the radiation is being applied. Purnell then incorporates these patients into a daily mental ritual. Between 4 and 6:30 in the morning, while the rest of the world is often still asleep, he performs his cuts for his entire list of remote clients. He focuses intensely on each person for several minutes, repeating his prayers 3 times. The results, according to his clients, are often startling. Some have reported being jolted awake at the exact moment Purnell begins his work, claiming they can feel the fire leaving their bodies through a form of telepathic connection. While the smartphone has streamlined this process, the concept of remote intervention is not a purely modern invention. The practice of healing across great distances has historical roots in the world wars, when fire cutters in rural villages were frequently called upon by frantic families to treat soldiers injured on distant battlefields. In an era of telegrams and slow post, the healer would use the soldier's name and a mental image of the front lines to bar the fire from hundreds of miles away. This wartime necessity established the precedent that the secret did not require the healer to lay hands on the wound, providing a historical foundation for the digital rituals of today. The shift toward remote healing is not merely a matter of convenience. For many healers, it has become a logistical necessity. Andre, a fire cutter living near the village of Derby, receives multiple calls every day from people she has never met. Her name circulates through an informal network of word-of-mouth recommendations, leading strangers to her doorstep, or more accurately, to her inbox. For patients dealing with the long-term side effects of chemotherapy or radiotherapy, Andre has moved almost entirely to SMS. She asks her patients to send her a simple text message with their first name after each medical session. This allows her to intervene immediately without the need for a lengthy phone conversation, integrating her ancient practice into the fast-paced schedule of a modern cancer ward. The effectiveness of these remote interventions is frequently cited in stories involving the most vulnerable patients, such as infants. Christine, a fire cutter in the Haute-Savoie, recalls a case involving an 18-month-old girl who had been severely burned by a wood-burning stove. The child had been treated at a hospital emergency room, but hours later she was still screaming in agony, unable to find rest. The parents, desperate and exhausted, called Christine. She performed the ritual over the phone, reciting her secret formulas while the parents held the receiver near the child. Within 10 minutes, the parents called back to report that the child had suddenly gone quiet and fallen into a deep, peaceful sleep. In this instance, the telephone acted as a direct conduit for a ritual that the parents believed saved their child from hours of further trauma.
The transition to digital communication has also changed how fire cutters are discovered. In the past, finding a healer required deep roots in a local community and a knowledge of who held the secret in a particular valley or village. Today, the search often begins on Google Maps or Facebook. Healers are now listed in online directories alongside yoga instructors and massage therapists. These modern registries reveal that the practice has expanded far beyond its traditional European heartlands. Fire cutters are now listed as operating in international locations as diverse as Bali, Martinique, and Marrakesh. In France, an estimated 6,000 fire cutters are currently active, and while many remain discreet, others have established a visible digital presence. They offer energy balance and fire cutting as part of a broader suite of alternative therapies, often maintaining a professionalized online presence that belies the ancient, oral origins of their craft. This professionalization has led to a fascinating blend of old-world ethics and new-world technology. The traditional rule that the gift must be free is still widely respected among the most sought-after remote healers. They see the smartphone not as a tool for profit, but as a way to expand their reach and help more people. However, the ease of digital communication has also created a new kind of burden. Healers like Marie Claude, who has been practicing for over 30 years, speak of the draining nature of remote work. Even though there is no physical contact, the mental focus required to absorb the fire of a stranger through a phone line takes a physical toll. Some healers report feeling exhausted or even experiencing a mild fever after a particularly intense session, regardless of the distance between them and the patient. The power of distance was put to a dramatic test during the tragic fire at the Constellation Bar in Crans-Montana on New Year's Eve in 2026. As the news of the disaster spread, a massive informal network of fire cutters across Switzerland and France was activated almost instantly via social media and emergency phone chains. Families of the victims, many of whom were minors with severe second and third degree burns, reached out to secret makers like Claude Alain Bichnow. Bichnow, an IT professional by trade, is known in the Valais region as a faiseur de secret. In the chaotic aftermath of the fire, he and many others worked around the clock, taking calls from hospital waiting rooms and receiving text messages from frantic relatives. They acted as a silent digital support system, working in parallel with the intensive care units to manage the excruciating pain of the survivors. This intersection of high-tech tragedy and ancient remedy highlights a unique cultural phenomenon in the French-speaking world, the telehealer. In these regions, the belief in the fire cutter is so ingrained that the medium of communication is seen as secondary to the intention of the practitioner. Whether the ritual is performed via a video call, a voice message, or a simple SMS, the underlying logic remains the same. The healer is tapping into a vibrational frequency or a universal energy that does not recognize the boundaries of space. For the patient, the act of sending an SMS or a photo is a way of opening a door to this energy, a digital gesture of consent that allows the healer to begin their work. The mechanics of a remote session are often described by practitioners in terms of waves or projections. Jean-Luc Curios, a well-known fire cutter, explains that his goal is to reject the heat from the patient's body. When working at a distance, he uses the patient's name and the description of the burn to create a mental bridge. He visualizes the person and the injury, then applies his whispered formulas and mental gestures as if the person were standing right in front of him. The silence on the other end of the phone line during these sessions is a hallmark of the experience. Many patients describe a heavy or electric silence, followed by a sudden cooling sensation that signals the end of the intervention. The digital age has also allowed for a more structured observation of these rituals, even if they remain scientifically elusive. In some families, the remote fire cut is treated with a level of precision that mirrors a clinical trial.
One anecdote involves a 17-year-old architecture student who burned her hand badly while welding a model. Her mother called a fire cutter, and the young woman's brother decided to put the healer to the test by setting a timer on his phone. The healer told them over the speakerphone that the pain would be gone in 5 minutes. Exactly 6 minutes later, the student looked at her family in shock, announcing that the searing pain had vanished entirely. For the younger generation, this kind of timed evidence is what bridges the gap between their digital-first world and the stories of their grandparents. However, the move to the digital sphere is not without its critics and skeptics, who often attribute these results to the placebo effect and the psychological modulation of pain. Yet, for the practitioners and the millions who consult them, these explanations feel insufficient. They point to the physicality of the remote experience, the heat felt by the healer and the cold felt by the patient, as evidence of a real, if unmeasured, energy transfer.
The cultural impact of this digital transition is profound. By moving on to the smartphone, fire cutters have escaped the risk of being seen as fossils of a bygone era. Instead, they have become a part of the modern wellness and complementary care movements. The digital directories and hospital lists that facilitate these connections are often managed by medical secretaries or nurses who act as unofficial gatekeepers, utilizing the same under-the-counter lists found in regions like Annecy and Thonon-les-Bains to bring the digital healer into the clinical space. The secret itself, which was once protected by the physical walls of a farmhouse, is now protected by the digital walls of encrypted messaging apps. Healers remain intensely protective of their formulas, even when communicating with their peers online. They might discuss the effects of a session in a Facebook group, but they will never type out the words of the secret. The digital medium has changed the speed of the work, but it has not changed the fundamental requirement for silence and oral transmission. You cannot find the true secret of a fire cutter through a search engine. It still requires a personal connection, even if that connection is initiated through a digital platform.
The case of Isabelle from Mont-Saint-Guibert offers a clear look at how these digital connections transcend national borders. When she spilled a pot of boiling soup on her arm, her neighbor suggested calling a fire cutter who lived in Switzerland. Isabelle, who had no medication on hand and was in extreme pain, made the international call. The woman on the other end asked for her name and the location of the pain, then hung up to perform the ritual. Isabelle reported that the pain literally flew away within minutes. The next day, she expected to see the massive blisters that typically follow such a burn, but her skin was clear and calm. This ability to reach across borders with a simple phone call has turned fire cutting into a globalized version of a once strictly local tradition. The telehealer phenomenon also allows for a unique kind of long-distance support during chronic illness. For cancer patients who may be too ill to travel to a healer's office, the digital connection is a lifeline. They describe the daily text from their fire cutter as a form of energetic hygiene that helps them get through the grueling weeks of treatment. The healer becomes a digital companion, a constant presence in their pocket that provides a sense of security. This ongoing relationship, facilitated by the ease of texting, has deepened the role of the fire cutter in the lives of their patients, moving it from a one-time emergency intervention to a sustained form of supportive care.
The digital age has also changed the way the dawn is perceived by the healers themselves. Many modern fire cutters, like Raphael Verduno, do not see themselves as having a supernatural power so much as being able to transmit a universal energy that is available to everyone. They use the language of frequencies and connections to explain why their work is so effective over the phone. For them, the digital network is just another layer of the source they are tapping into. The smartphone is simply a modern antenna that helps them focus their intention on a specific point in the vast web of human existence. This digital transformation has ensured that the practice of fire cutting remains a living, breathing part of the cultural fabric. It has allowed the secret to step out of the shadows of the past and into the light of the digital present. As the fire cutters have adapted to the tools of the modern world, they have also begun to find a new kind of acceptance within the very institutions that once sought to marginalize them. The quiet murmurs of the healers are now echoing through the halls of modern hospitals, creating an unspoken alliance that is reshaping the boundaries of patient care. This growing yet discreet cooperation between the traditional healer and the modern medical professional is the next chapter in the enduring story of the fire cutters. In the sterile, brightly lit corridors of modern European hospitals, where every procedure is governed by strict clinical protocols and peer-reviewed data, a quiet and somewhat paradoxical alliance has taken root. If you were to walk into the radiotherapy department of a major medical center in Annecy or the emergency rooms of Thonon-les-Bains, you might find something unexpected tucked away in a desk drawer or pinned to a staff notice board. It is a simple list of names and phone numbers, often handwritten or photocopied dozens of times. These are not the contact details for specialized surgeons or high-tech laboratories, but for local fire cutters. This unspoken partnership between the bastions of medical science and the practitioners of ancient folk traditions represents a pragmatic shift in how modern medicine approaches the limits of its own interventions. The integration of fire cutters into the hospital environment is rarely a matter of official policy. Instead, it exists as a form of grassroots pragmatism initiated by nurses, medical secretaries, and increasingly by the physicians themselves. This alliance is most visible in the oncology department, a relationship that traces its roots back to the mid-20th century. The industrialization of radiotherapy in the 1950s created a massive, unprecedented demand for fire cutters. As early radiation treatments became a standard of care, they often resulted in severe, agonizing skin eruptions that conventional pharmacology was ill-equipped to manage. It was during this era of medical transition that the fire cutter moved from the rural farmhouse toward the clinical waiting room, filling a void left by the harshness of early oncological technology. Today, while radiation is more precise, it still often leaves patients with radiodermitis, painful burns that can range from mild redness to severe weeping ulcerations. For many patients, the specialized creams and ointments provided by the hospital offer only limited relief. It is in this gap between the necessity of the treatment and the unbearable nature of its side effects that the fire cutter is invited to step in. The medical professionals who facilitate this connection generally fall into two categories: the pragmatists and the protectors. The pragmatists are driven by a singular focus on patient comfort. Dr. Daniel Sarin, a prominent oncologist and vice president of the St. Catherine Institute in Avignon, is a leading voice for this perspective. Having spent decades treating breast cancer, he openly acknowledges that he has observed a significant reduction in pain and a better tolerance for treatment in patients who consult a fire cutter. Dr. Sarin speaks of the transition from skepticism to professional humility. He notes that when the first patient tells you they feel better because of a healer, you might dismiss it as an anomaly. But when the 100th patient reports the same thing, a responsible doctor must pay attention. For him, the mechanism remains a mystery, but the benefit to the patient's quality of life is an undeniable clinical fact. Similarly, Dr. Alain Marr, the head of radio-oncology in Rodez, has spent over 30 years quietly directing patients toward local healers. His philosophy is rooted in the fundamental contract between a doctor and a patient, the duty to relieve suffering. He argues that if a practice is free, does no harm, and demonstrably improves a patient's ability to complete life-saving treatment, it would be irrational to refuse it simply because it does not fit into a current scientific model. This perspective was championed by the late Dr. David Servan-Schreiber, a figure who did much to bridge the gap between conventional oncology and complementary care. He viewed the use of healers as a rational, compassionate complement to a patient's clinical journey, a way to address the human experience of illness that data alone could not reach. This shift from asking how it works to asking if it helps has allowed these two very different worlds to coexist within the same clinical space.
The protectors, on the other hand, view the hospital lists as a form of harm reduction. Eric Dutoit, a psychologist in the oncology department at the Timon Hospital in Marseille, helped formalize a list of fire cutters in 2005. He recognized that patients in extreme pain are often desperate and easily targeted by predatory individuals. By providing a curated list of reliable local practitioners who abide by the traditional code of ethics, most notably the requirement that the service be provided for free, the hospital ensures that their patients are not exploited by charlatans. This approach acknowledges the reality of patient behavior rather than trying to suppress it, bringing the practice into the light where it can be monitored.
The immediacy of this alliance is perhaps most striking in emergency departments. In high-stress environments where every second counts, the staff often find themselves balancing official protocols with the immediate need to calm a suffering patient. While modern medicine relies on the rule of 315s as the modern medical benchmark for burn treatment, these measures do not always address the immediate radiating agony of the patient. Dr. Danielle Tavernier, who directed the emergency department in Thonon-les-Bains, noted that while traditional analgesics might take 20 minutes to begin working, children brought in with severe burns often stopped crying almost instantly after a fire cutter was contacted. This led the staff to maintain a discrete list of trusted practitioners who could be reached at any hour, often placing the call before the painkillers had even been fully administered. This collaboration is not limited to general radiation burns, but extends to more specific and severe medical conditions. Dr. Mathilde Damileville-Martin recalls a particularly dramatic case involving a young woman treated for tongue cancer. The patient had developed grade 3 mucositis, or mucite, a condition where the lining of the mouth and throat becomes a mass of severe, agonizing sores. Conventional treatments were failing to manage the pain. After the intervention of a fire cutter, the sores and the pain vanished with a speed that profoundly questioned the doctor's clinical expectations. Such cases illustrate that the alliance is often forged in the face of conditions where modern pharmacology reaches its limits.
The presence of fire cutters in hospitals is becoming increasingly normalized, even in the most prestigious institutions. As recently as 2023, at the CHU of Haute-Pierre in Strasbourg, a surgeon directly recommended a fire cutter to a patient named Natalie during a pre-radiotherapy consultation. This specific recent example highlights how the unspoken nature of the alliance is slowly becoming a matter of open professional dialogue. It is no longer just a secret whispered between nurses. It is a recommendation coming from the highest levels of surgical expertise. The impact of this integration is perhaps most clearly seen in the lives of the medical staff who inhabit both worlds. Myriam Mouchette, an emergency nurse working in the regions of Annecy and Thonon-les-Bains, embodies this dual identity. She manages the high-pressure environment of ambulances and emergency rooms while also utilizing the prayers and gestures passed down to her as a fire cutter. She recalls a woman who had been severely burned by boiling oil, a case where the medical team was preparing for a difficult month of skin grafts and intense pain management. Myriam performed a fire cut alongside the standard medical dressings. To the surprise of the attending surgeons, the need for a skin graft was eventually canceled because the skin began to regenerate at an extraordinary pace. For Myriam, there is no conflict between her roles. She simply uses every tool available to help the person in front of her.
The scale of this phenomenon is supported by institutional observations. At the Lucien Neuwirth Cancer Institute near Saint-Étienne, a study revealed that 61% of healthcare professionals in the region's emergency services characterized the collaboration with fire cutters as desirable. This is not the language of superstition. It is the language of clinical observation by people who see suffering every day and recognize the value of any intervention that provides relief. Even in Switzerland, the integration is culturally embedded. Dr. Claire Guillemin, who directed radiotherapy services in Lausanne, has noted that the intervention of healers undeniably seems to accelerate the healing of tissues after anti-cancer treatments.
In Belgium, at the Institut Bordeaux, the staff in the radiotherapy department do not discourage patients from seeking fire cutters, often providing names of practitioners they know to be reliable. However, this alliance is not a global phenomenon. While European hospitals are increasingly opening their doors to these traditions, the practice remains a significant taboo in other parts of the world. In Quebec, the medical establishment has taken a much more adversarial stance. The College of Physicians has even pursued legal action against practitioners, viewing the work of fire cutters as the illegal practice of medicine. This stark contrast highlights the unique cultural landscape of France, Switzerland, and Belgium, where the medical community has largely chosen a path of pragmatic coexistence over legal confrontation. The unspoken alliance also serves to reduce the moral distress of the caregivers themselves. Nurses and doctors in burn units often witness the limitations of powerful analgesics like morphine, which can sedate a patient but do not always quench the specific radiating sensation of a burn. When a fire cutter is involved, staff often report a sense of relief as they watch a patient's heart rate slow and their facial tension vanish. This cooperation was even visible during large-scale crises, such as the response to the 2026 fire at the Constellation Bar in Crans-Montana and the role of Claude Alain Bichnow. Ultimately, the presence of fire cutters in modern hospitals challenges the traditional hierarchy of medical care. It introduces a figure who operates entirely outside the bureaucratic and financial structures of the institution. Because the fire cutter typically refuses payment and has no official status, they represent a human, almost familial form of care that provides a counterpoint to the often intimidating machinery of a large hospital. They are the guardians of the emotional and sensory experience of the patient, a role that modern medicine, with its focus on objective data, sometimes struggles to fulfill. This relationship is increasingly framed through the lens of supportive care, or soins de support. By categorizing the fire cutter's work as a way to improve overall well-being and the ability to endure difficult treatments, hospitals find a place for it within their conceptual framework without having to validate it as a medical science. It is a partnership based on a shared goal, the comfort of the human being who is suffering. As we observe how these two worlds have come together, we are forced to confront the fundamental nature of the relief being provided. If doctors can see the results but cannot explain the cause, we must look closer at the intersection of the mind and the body. The comfort found in the hospital room through the work of a fire cutter leads us directly into a deeper investigation of the science of belief. We must ask whether the relief patients feel is a purely psychological response to a trusted ritual, or if there is something more objective happening at the biological level that we have yet to measure. This tension between subjective experience and objective reality raises a critical question. Can the brain truly command the body to stop the fire? Chapter 4. The Science of Belief. The Mind-Body Paradox. When a patient describes the sensation of a fire cut, they often use language that is visceral and absolute. They speak of a heat that was once a screaming, jagged presence suddenly smoothing out into a cool, quiet hum. To the person in the hospital bed, this is not a theory or a psychological curiosity. It is a hard physical reality. However, when the tools of modern clinical science are brought to bear on this phenomenon, a striking gap begins to emerge between the subjective relief felt by the individual and the objective markers that doctors use to measure healing. This tension defines the scientific study of belief, where researchers attempt to map the boundary between the power of the human mind and the biological processes of the body. The most significant analysis of this gap stems from the study conducted at the Lucia Neuwirth Cancer Institute. While the prevalence of fire cutting among radiotherapy patients is well documented, the detailed analysis of the results reveals a profound contradiction. When researchers examined the objective biological criteria, specifically the levels of inflammation in the skin known as radiodermitis and the actual consumption of prescribed painkillers, they found no measurable difference between patients who consulted a fire cutter and those who did not. Biologically, the skin was just as irritated, and the body was still processing the same level of tissue damage. However, the study uncovered a phenomenon that researchers have termed the fatigue irony. While the patients who sought out a fire cutter reported a significantly better subjective tolerance for their treatment and a more optimistic outlook, the objective data showed they were actually significantly more fatigued than those who relied solely on conventional medicine. This suggests that the subjective feeling of well-being may act as a psychological mask, potentially obscuring the systemic physical toll the treatment continues to take on the body. The fire cutter does not appear to change the burn itself, but rather fundamentally alters how the brain perceives and processes the pain and the experience of the injury. This discrepancy is most visceral in cases of mucositis, a common side effect of cancer treatment where the lining of the mouth and throat becomes a mass of severe ulcerations. A physician may observe a patient with grade 3 mucositis, a condition characterized by visible, agonizing sores, and find that the patient suddenly reports a total absence of pain after a fire cut. The tissue damage remains visible to the clinical eye, yet the patient's experience of that damage has been fundamentally disconnected. The fire cutter has not healed the wound, but they have successfully interrupted the signal of pain before it reaches the patient's consciousness.
To provide a counterpoint to the findings at Saint Etienne, one must look at a similar study conducted in the Berry region. In this study of 145 patients, the results were even more lopsided in favor of the healers, with 89% of participants reporting a clear improvement in their condition. Yet even within these high success rates, there is a consistent failure rate that is often omitted from the anecdotal lore of the secret. Data indicates that between 10 and 15% of patients feel no effect at all. This suggests that the efficacy of the practice is not universal and may depend on a specific psychological alignment or receptivity that is not present in every individual. A major claim often made by proponents of fire cutting is that the ritual prevents the formation of scars. Rationalist critics, however, point to a simpler explanation rooted in dermatology. The vast majority of burns treated by fire cutters are first-degree or superficial second-degree burns. Biologically, these types of injuries do not naturally leave scars. By intervening at the moment of crisis, the healer creates a correlation in the patient's mind that science views as a natural biological outcome. The miracle of the unscarred skin is, in many cases, the body simply following its own predictable recovery curve. This timing is central to the explanation offered by researchers like Richard Monvasian, who points to a statistical reality known as regression to the mean. Patients typically seek out a fire cutter at the absolute peak of their pain. Because pain is naturally cyclical and the body eventually begins to regulate its own alarm signals, any intervention performed at the peak is likely to be followed by a natural decline in intensity. When the pain begins to recede 10 minutes after a ritual, the patient naturally attributes this to the healer, even though the body was biologically programmed to start cooling down at that exact moment. To understand why this relief feels so profound, we must look at the neurobiology of pain. Pain is not a simple one-to-one reflection of tissue damage. It is a signal modulated by the brain's emotional state. Anxiety and fear act as amplifiers for these signals. When a fire cutter intervenes, the ritual and the focused attention of the healer provide a powerful psychological countersignal. This reduction in anxiety triggers the release of endogenous opioids, the body's natural painkillers, which can dull the sensation of pain even if the underlying injury remains unchanged. This scientific skepticism is not a modern invention, but part of a long intellectual lineage dating back to 1784. At that time, a royal commission, including Benjamin Franklin, was tasked with investigating the theory of animal magnetism, the idea that an invisible fluid could be manipulated for healing. The commission formally discredited the theory, concluding that the effects were the product of the patient's imagination rather than any physical force. Modern researchers view the fire cutter through this same lens, seeing the ritual as a sophisticated psychological trigger, the essence of the placebo effect, which in neuroscience is recognized as a real, measurable physiological change in the brain's chemistry. The medicine is the context of the healing ritual itself, acting as a key that unlocks the brain's internal pharmacy. This psychological mechanism is even more nuanced in the placebo by proxy effect observed in infants. When a child is calmed by a remote fire cut, skeptics point to the immediate impact on the parents. The intervention often calms the caregivers first. Their heart rates drop and their stress levels plummet as they believe help is being administered. This shift in the parent's emotional state is immediately detected by the infant, who responds to the calmer touch and voice of the parent. The child is not reacting to a mysterious secret, but to the secondary calming effect of a less stressed caregiver. However, healers often challenge this psychological explanation by citing the reported success of fire cutting on animals. They argue that if a horse or a dog, neither of which is susceptible to human psychological suggestion or the cultural wake of a secret, can be calmed and healed by a fire cut, then the placebo effect cannot be the sole mechanism at work. To the practitioner, the animal's response is the ultimate proof that they are interacting with a biological reality that transcends the human mind's capacity for belief. There have been attempts to measure the fluid or energy that fire cutters claim to manipulate. Researchers have used sensitive electromagnetic detectors and thermal imaging to see if anything is actually passing from the healer to the patient. To date, no such signal has ever been detected. There is no measurable drop in the temperature of the skin that can be attributed to the ritual, nor is there any evidence of a unique energy field. The sensation of heat reported by the healer and the cooling reported by the patient appear to be entirely subjective experiences, internal to the nervous systems of the individuals involved, rather than a physical exchange of energy. Yet scientists like Bruno Falissard argue that these practices should not be dismissed simply because a physical fluid cannot be found. He suggests that the irrational has a legitimate place in medicine because humans are not purely rational creatures. If a practice can contribute to a patient's well-being and help them through a traumatic treatment, it has clinical value regardless of its mechanism. The fire cutter has mastered the art of therapeutic presence, a skill that is often undervalued in modern medical training. They provide a dedicated moment of singular focus, validating the patient's experience and making them feel they are no longer alone in their crisis. The fire cutter provides a narrative for pain. By using a secret passed down for centuries, they connect the patient's individual suffering to a wider history of communal healing. This gives the pain a meaning and a context, which in itself can make it easier to bear. The rituals act as a bridge between the biological reality of the injury and the psychological reality of the person suffering from it. While the standard medical protocols focus on the rapid reduction of tissue temperature, the fire cutter operates in the subjective space where the pain actually lives. The clinical reality is that the fire cutter and the physician are looking at two different things, the tissue versus the person. The objective data showing no change in physical inflammation does not invalidate the subjective data of the patients who felt better. Both are true at the same time. The skin remains burned, but the person is no longer suffering in the same way. This balance between the subjective and the objective is what has allowed the fire cutter to survive the scrutiny of the scientific age. As this practice continues to integrate into the modern medical environment, it raises new questions about the nature of the gift itself. If the relief is primarily a product of belief and ritual, what happens when that ritual is removed from its traditional, communal roots? The requirement that the gift be used for the good of others without the corruption of money has been the ethical anchor of the tradition for centuries. However, as the practice moves into the urban and digital spheres, this ancient code is being challenged by the pressures of a professionalized wellness economy. The transition from a communal service to a potential profession brings with it new risks and a different set of questions about the future of the secret. Chapter 5. The burden of the gift: money, mercy, and mystery. The moral architecture of fire cutting is built upon a single, uncompromising pillar, the concept of the gift, or le don. In the traditional rural societies where this practice was forged, the ability to bar the fire was never viewed as a professional skill to be marketed or a commodity to be sold. Instead, it was a sacred or natural charge, a form of community service that carried a heavy ethical weight. For the traditionalists, the power to heal is inextricably linked to the refusal of payment. This ethical stance is not merely a preference, it is believed to be the very source of the healer's efficacy. There is a pervasive conviction among the old-school practitioners that the moment a secret is viewed as a source of income, the power will vanish, leaving the formulas hollow and the gestures empty. This uncompromising ethics of gratuity finds its historical anchor in the figure of Maître Philippe de Lyon. A renowned thaumaturge at the turn of the 20th century, Nizier-Anthelme Philippe became a legendary figure for his refusal to accept mauvais for his healings. He treated the most destitute citizens of Lyon with the same dedication he offered to the family of Tsar Nicholas II. When hauled before courts on charges of practicing medicine without a license, his primary defense, and the reason for his frequent acquittals, was his absolute refusal of payment. He famously insisted that he was merely a conduit, stating that he was nothing, and that the healing came from a higher source. This historical precedent established a standard for the sacerdoce of the fire cutter, a vocation that demands humility and a total separation from the world of commerce. In the traditional world, the exchange for a fire cut remains symbolic and communal, reinforcing the social bond rather than a commercial transaction. A patient might return a few days later with a token of gratitude that reflects the local terroir. While chocolates and flowers are common, the sources of these traditions often mention more specific offerings, like boxes of pralines or homemade cakes. In the past, this might have been a basket of eggs or a chicken. These gifts are not seen as payment, but as a way for the patient to acknowledge the healer's effort without assigning a market value to the secret. This system of symbolic exchange ensures the healer remains a benevolent member of the community rather than a service provider. The ethical weight of the gift is also reflected in the specific, often rigid rules governing its transmission. To maintain its spiritual power, the secret is not something that can be handed over casually. In many lineages, such as that of Marlene in the Swiss tradition, the gift must be transmitted at specific, highly symbolic times to retain its efficacy. The most common requirement is that the oral transmission occurs at the stroke of midnight on Christmas Eve. This temporal restriction elevates the secret from a mere piece of information to a sacred trust tied to a moment of perceived spiritual opening. It reinforces the idea that the power is not owned by the individual, but is part of a larger cyclical mystery. This sense of duty is further underscored by the physical toll the practice takes on the healer, who often experiences the sensation of absorbing the heat. This physical manifestation of the patient's suffering is why many traditionalists view the idea of charging money as almost sacrilegious. If the healer is truly sacrificing their own physical comfort to relieve another, the introduction of a fee would transform a profound act of mercy into a mere labor contract. The refusal of payment is, in this sense, a protective measure that ensures the work is done only when the healer has the genuine capacity and desire to help. However, as fire cutting has moved from the isolated farmhouse into the modern urban landscape, this ethical clarity has begun to blur. A new generation of practitioners, often calling themselves magnetizers or energy therapists, has emerged. Unlike the traditional village healer, these individuals often treat their practice as a professional activity. In cities like Lyon or Paris, it is now possible to find practitioners who charge a fixed fee, arguing that they are not charging for the gift itself, but for their time, their availability, and the overhead costs of maintaining a professional cabinet.
They see themselves as part of the broader wellness economy, providing a specialized service that requires significant mental and physical exertion.
This shift toward monetization is particularly visible in the treatment of chronic conditions, such as the side effects of cancer therapies. Because radiotherapy requires multiple sessions over several weeks, the volume of calls can become overwhelming for a practitioner who also holds a full-time job. To manage this, some modern practitioners have introduced specialized pricing structures that attempt to bridge the gap between tradition and professional reality. For example, the GCM Muet model utilizes a sliding scale: €20 for the first session, $10 for the second, and the third session is free. Crucially, some of these professionalized practitioners offer their services entirely for free specifically for patients undergoing radiotherapy, recognizing the unique burden of cancer treatment. This professionalization creates a significant tension. Traditionalists view these fees as a betrayal of the secret's core ethics, while the modernists see them as a necessary adaptation to a world where healers no longer live in self-sustaining rural villages. This debate is not just about money, it is about the nature of the power itself. If the efficacy of the fire cut is truly dependent on the purity of the healer's intention, does the introduction of a financial transaction weaken that intention? There is no consensus, but the rise of the paid healer has certainly changed the social contract of fire cutting, moving it from a communal secret to a non-conventional care method.
The risk of charlatanism is the shadow that haunts this transition toward monetization. When a practice is unencumbered by official regulation or scientific validation, it becomes an attractive field for those seeking to exploit the vulnerable. Patients suffering from severe burns or the grueling side effects of chemotherapy are often in a state of high emotional distress, making them susceptible to false promises. In France, the MIVLUDS, the Interministerial Mission for Monitoring Sectarian Drifts, has identified specific criteria for identifying dangerous practitioners. The first red flag is the cost. When a healer demands excessive sums of money, often under the guise of intensive energy work, it is a clear sign of potential exploitation. The second, and perhaps more dangerous signal, is the attempt to cut the patient off from conventional medicine. A legitimate fire cutter, even one who charges a fee, will always insist that their work is complementary. In regional variations of the practice, such as the tailleurs de feu found in the Lot or Dordogne, the practitioners are often the first to tell a patient to call an ambulance if a burn is too deep. A charlatan, however, might suggest that medical treatments are toxic and that only their pure energy can save the patient. This can lead to emprise, a psychological hold where the healer becomes the patient's only source of truth, often encouraging them to distance themselves from skeptical family members. The question of competence is another ethical hurdle. In the medical world, diplomas provide a baseline of quality. In the world of fire cutting, there is only the reputation of the lineage. This lack of objective standards has led to the rise of express training programs, where individuals can pay for a weekend workshop and receive a certificate in fire cutting. Traditionalists view these workshops with profound skepticism, arguing that the secret cannot be bought in a seminar. They believe that without the long-term commitment and the oral transmission from an elder, often involving the specific timing of Christmas Eve, these new practitioners are merely performing a theatrical version of the ritual without the underlying ethical charge. The ethics of the gift also serves as a protective boundary for the healer's own well-being. A healer motivated by money might be tempted to take on too many patients, leading to energetic exhaustion. From this perspective, the traditional refusal of payment ensures that the practitioner only intervenes when they are at their full strength. This is why many of the most respected faiseurs de secret in Switzerland and France still have unlisted numbers and are found only through word of mouth. This barrier to entry filters out the casual seekers and ensures that the relationship between the healer and the patient is based on a shared understanding of the tradition's weight. The modern monetization of fire cutting has also led to a debate about the democratization of the gift. Some argue that by charging a fee and advertising online, healers are making the practice more accessible to people who don't have deep roots in rural communities. They see it as a way to bring relief to a wider audience. Others counter that this marketization strips the practice of its cultural soul, turning a communal heritage into a luxury service for the urban elite. They worry that the secret will eventually become just another brand in the marketplace of alternative medicine, indistinguishable from any other energy healing product. For the patient, the choice between a traditional free fire cutter and a modern paid practitioner often comes down to their own cultural background. A person who grew up in the mountains of the Haute-Savoie will likely seek out a neighbor who has the secret and offer them a cake or a box of pralines. A city dweller in the middle of a painful shingles outbreak might be more comfortable booking a session with a practitioner who has a professional website and a clear pricing structure. Both are seeking the same result, an end to the fire, but they are engaging with two very different versions of the same tradition.
The ultimate ethical boundary for any fire cutter, whether traditional or modern, is the safety of the patient. A responsible practitioner knows when the fire is too deep for their ritual alone. They are the ones who, upon seeing a severe burn, will tell the patient to hang up and call an ambulance immediately. This cooperation with medical reality is the hallmark of a legitimate healer. They see themselves as an emergency brake for pain, a temporary relief that allows the patient to breathe while the biological work of medical healing takes place. This delicate balance between the gift and the market, between the secret and the directory, is what defines the current state of fire cutting. The practice is at a crossroads, trying to maintain its ancient ethical heart while navigating the demands of a professionalized world. As the secret continues to be passed from one hand to another, the enduring mystery is not just how it works, but whether it can retain its power once it is assigned a price tag. Can a tradition rooted in the midnight silence of Christmas Eve and the sacrifice of the healer survive the transition into a transparent, monetized economy? The coupeurs de feu represent a remarkable survival of ancient wisdom in our high-tech world. From whispered medieval prayers to modern text messages sent from oncology wards, this tradition bridges the gap between folklore and clinical medicine. While science struggles to quantify the secret, the pragmatic alliance found in hospitals proves that relief often transcends data. Whether viewed as a psychological anchor or a genuine energetic transfer, the fire cutter reminds us that healing is as much about the spirit as it is about the skin. As these practitioners navigate the tension between the sacred gift and a monetized world, they challenge us to reconsider the boundaries of the possible. Perhaps some mysteries are not meant to be solved, but simply felt. In the silence between the healer and the suffering, the fire finally fades. Thank you for listening.